Hi, and welcome to the I Teach Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 81, Deep Dive, UI UX. So, UI UX, also known as user interface and user experience. It is what you probably used to get to this podcast before you clicked on it. Or maybe you clicked on it a long ass time ago, and now it does everything for you and automatically downloads the next episode as it releases. See, that's great. That's forward thinking. That's amazing. And thank you for your pretend internet points. Anyway, the UI, user interface or user experience, is an important part of how normal people interact with systems. And we say normal people because as IT guys, as technologists, developers, whoever, working on computers for a long, long time, you've probably experienced and found that things might be easier to do with just command line interface or CLI. And the problem with CLI is that you are having to remember and memorize a lot of commands, which can and is very difficult for beginners to an application or to technology or whatever. People who aren't experienced, who don't spend a lot of their time doing it, have no need to memorize the commands, and it makes it very difficult. I kind of covered some of why that is a problem in our episodes on PowerShell. But basically, commands can be difficult to remember, CD being change directory, dir meaning listed directory, or ls in Linux meaning list. That those can kind of be self-explanatory. But what the fuck is git-apt? Like, what the fuck does that mean? You try to explain that to a normal person, and they lose their shit. And it's the same thing. What the fuck is curl? Curl? I don't understand what that means. All of that is, or it can be, very difficult. And then that's not even to mention switches and options and shit like that you can run through with command line interface and all of that. And we're not even touching on the actual thing that user interface replaces, which is code. So user interface is CLI is just another example of a user interface, because you are basically shortening machine command down to a quick and easily entered form of command. And in CLI, it's different because, you're writing everything letter by letter, and you're having to make things, you're having to make these decisions in the command line, and you're not having to have it, you don't have any visual representation available to you to identify what you are doing. Really, command line is done all by memory and has almost no overhead. Whereas an actual user interface has overhead. There is a visual component to it. Because there is user interaction, it allows the user to see an example of what they are trying to do, or it allows them to track what they've selected prior, so that way they can continue to make decisions and not have to worry about the decisions that they've already made. That's kind of key for user interface. So like, as you're entering in data, you aren't having to constantly go back and ensure that that data is accurate or that something hasn't changed, so on and so forth. And in reality, a user interface, like I said a little bit ago, is a front end for a program. Basically, it's the representation of commands given to the machine at the compiled level. So what that means is that your one click of a button may be 1,000 lines of code. It may be 1,000,000 lines of code, but that one click of a button isn't just click do this. It's doing a lot of other stuff behind the scenes. And that's where the key of knowledge for programming comes into play, because if you don't know how to program that button to do what you want, it's kind of useless. You can name that button, you can label it whatever the fuck you want, but the machine has no idea what to do with the click until you tell it what to do. And even then, you're going to have to walk through everything step by step, grabbing the variables and inserting them in and identifying how they are used and in what way and where they go, so on and so forth. Programming and development I'm not going to pretend to be an expert at that, because I'm definitely not. I'm not a coder. I'm not a developer. I am as close to a script kiddie as you can possibly fucking get. So don't at me, bro. Anyway, the whole point being is that in code development, when you guys are making applications, when you code bros are making applications, you are writing these things in a way that makes sense to the development process and to the developer. And so when you represent that to the user, it has to be in a way that makes sense to both you and the user, or at least to the user, because of the ones who are going to end up utilizing it. And that can be one of the things that a lot of developers forget. And that's why there are two types of developers. There are front-end developers and there are back-end developers. Back-end developers work on the back end of a system. They work on the code. They work on the aspects of making sure that the application actually works, whereas front-end developers make sure that the application can be used. If that makes any sense, because the front-end developers are responsible for making sure that buttons look like they are supposed to, they go in the right place, and they do the things they're supposed to do. Whereas the overall responsibility for the operation of the application or service or whatever is maintained by the back-end developers. And very rarely do you get somebody who can be a full stack developer who can do both front and back end. There are some people who are like that. They're crazy and insane people who are probably smarter than I'll ever be, but they've damaged their brain by being so smart. UI developers, front end developers are like artists. They are people who who probably get a kick off of coloring very specifically within the lines and feel a sense of accomplishment by coloring an entire sheet of paper. They probably did a bunch of arts and crafts as kids, because that's basically what UI design is. It's art. It's a form of art. It is a form of design that requires some level of knowledge of how people think and how flow works. And it can be unique, it can be different, and it can be wonderful. It can be very efficient, it can be very quick, but it's very difficult to do well, consistently, and right. And if you want to see some really good user design or UI design, just think about all of the applications that you use that you don't even think about, like your phone. Your phone's UI is probably one of the things that you interact with most that has been designed so tightly that you don't even think about how to use it. Because, like, let's think about this. If you open your phone and go to your apps, you instinctively know how to do that. And most people instinctively know how to use your phone, not because there's anything inherent to the phone on how to use it, but because that's just how good UI works. It works by an instinct. Now, there are some UI differences between devices and device types and things like that. In fact, I just got a new cell phone and I utilize a very specific launcher on my Android phone, and I was forced to use the Samsung One UI for a while, which is absolute dog shit. Like, I kept trying to open up my app tray, and in my normal phone, in my phone that I've used for forever, I just swipe up. I just swipe up on my screen and I get to my app tray. On Samsung, I don't remember how to do it because that's how bad that UI was. It just I could not fucking understand it. So That's an example of a UI. And that's an example of a good UI that you probably have used all the time because you don't even think about how to use it. And that is good UI overall. But let's look at bad examples or examples for bad UI. I was recently in a Tesla for the first fucking time. Don't make fun of me. I don't know. Anyway, Teslas are cars made by a technology company, and you can tell that they're made by a technology company, not by a car company, because there are certain things that are kind of off about it when you get into a car. And I understand, aside from all the political shit, aside from everything else, one of the things that you have to understand about Tesla is that it is, again, it's made by a technology company, so it's going to be a little different, and they're doing things a little differently than what car companies are. But when you get into a car, and when you get into a Tesla, there are certain things that you suddenly understand about why car companies were doing things the way they were. So, for one example, bad UI example in a Tesla is it takes you 3 clicks on the main screen to turn on the windshield wipers. That's a normal thing. Like that's a normal process because the windshield wipers are not mapped to the normal switch or whatever the fuck it is, the knob or whatever. They're not mapped to that. You have to map it manually. You have to tell it, oh, I want this thing to be my windshield wipers. And it's the same thing with a lot of stuff like that. Like you can tell it to turn on your headlights from the main console, but you can also tell it to map those buttons elsewhere. And that's fucking insane because there are certain things, safety aspects, which should never move. They should be predictable. They should be understandable. Anybody should be able to get into your vehicle and know how to operate it safely. That is what we have designed cars or what car designers have made sure of over the last few years. It's like suddenly changing the direction of the seat belt. It's almost uncanny valley in a lot of ways. And it's it can be a smaller gripe because now it takes me 3 extra button clicks to get to the fucking windshield wiper. That I understand how that kind of sounds, but when you're in a downpour on a highway and suddenly you don't know how to turn on your windshield wipers, you are a fucking hazard on the road. That is a problem. Anyway, rant over for Tesla. Tesla, that they're just an example of a bad UI. And again, they are a car company, or they are a technology company that is making cars, and not a car company that has been doing it for a long, long time, that has learned the mistakes and is doing better, or has a planned process of releasing changes and things like that. As another example of a bad UI, we'll use Microsoft because I love to fucking pick on Microsoft. And now don't get me wrong, Microsoft does a lot of things right. Their Windows UI, their Windows Explorer, their start menu, it's all very good. And honestly, it does get better iteration after iteration. Sometimes it's hard to change. But one example of their extremely bad UI choices is actually in their Microsoft 365 platform. And most users don't have to deal with this. And honestly, most IT guys probably don't end up having to deal with this because of the fucking expense that it takes to get there. But let's say you are wanting to utilize the paid Windows Defender for Endpoint solution. The Windows Defender for Endpoint solution is Microsoft's managed EDR or enhanced detection and response platform. You can buy add-ons to it to enable a lot of other features. And depending on what feature you've added to the EDR application and what you want to do with the EDR, you may have to make changes in several different places. So, for instance, if you wanted to make a change to what applications a user is allowed to run and how the EDR interacts with that, you have a few choices to make there. Well, do you want to exclude it from scanning? Because you need to do that through the purview window inside of the compliance portal. If you want to add it to the application security list. Oh, that's an Intune. So you need to go to Entra ID to go to the Intune tab to edit that. What about if I want to add a website to a block list? Oh, well, that is also going to be in the purview section, but it's not going to be in the main Windows Defender purview section. No, you're going to have to go into the settings section of purview, select the Defender tab, go into that, find the DNS settings in the list of 120 other settings that you have to edit, go to that, select the whitelist, and then add it to the proper policy. And that is a selection, that is an identification of a bad UI, because I'm having to go to several different places to do something similar that is, it's just a bad experience. An example of a good UI for this, as a comparison, is Bitdefender. Yeah, Bitdefender. Bitdefender is another EDR application, and it's good. It's expensive. It's also very heavy on the CPU, but their UI is probably better than a lot of other EDR manufacturers, because your exclusion list, they have one section where you go to add your exclusions. That section, you can go in, click on it. Now, you can get to that same section for each individual type of exclusion you want to add by going to the actual individual section and going to the exclusion tab there. But they actually have just a separate fucking exclusions area where you add it, and then you tell it what type of exclusion it is. I want to exclude this from scanning. I want to exclude this from blocking. I want to exclude this as a website. You can add that shit, and it's just very quick, very easy to do. Now, all that being said, UI is hard. It is very difficult to do when you are not used to making UI, because you have to understand how people think. You have to understand what people are looking at first, what they're going to look at last, what they're going to choose. You have to understand what is going to piss people off when they have to select stuff, what's going to make it easy for them. You also have to, combat cultural issues and social issues and whatnot. For example, one of the things that used to be a thing across the internet, that the United States was always listed as the first country in the list of countries when creating an account and selecting your nationality. And that was just because the vast majority of users on the internet were from the United States. Now that things have changed and political structures have changed and opinions have changed, people are like, that's bullshit. Put them in alphabetical order where they fucking belong, which is accurate. 100%. I agree. But it pissed a lot of people off because it was all of a sudden, America not number one. We angry. And yeah, okay, I get it. But as a UI designer, that can be a difficult thing to make a decision on. Personally, I think as a UI designer, you're probably relieved that you no longer had to put the United States first, because that probably took some doing to code, honestly. And it was a pain in the dick. It would have been, at least. But, you also have other things like you can't necessarily have a checkbox where a radio button needs to be. So if you have a Boolean value, normally you would represent that with a checkbox. But sometimes you need to have a radio box when you can only select one item in a list. And so figuring out where that selection is and figuring out how to map that properly is probably going to be a giant pain in the ass. And then as a front-end designer, if you don't have a good back-end designer or somebody who's competent at basically linking the front end and the back end together, you can have a really bad time. And you get this, you see this a lot when you go to websites, and like, let's say you want to add a product and buy it. Like, you add it to your cart, you go to the checkout, You click the checkout button. I don't know if anybody else has ever had this fucking happen to you, but you go to the checkout and you click checkout. And at that point, only at that point, does the system tell you that your product is out of stock and that you cannot order that product. Or, it's even better is when you're allowed to check out, give them your money, and then you receive an email. Oh, this is on back order for 2 weeks. You're not going to be able to receive it. That's fucking fun, isn't it? And that is an example of a bad UI design or bad implementation of the UI to front end to back end. Those issues are extremely fucking annoying, and they can be very difficult to program around if you're not careful. So, as you're walking around with operating user interfaces and trying to use applications, computers, your phone, fucking gaming system, your TV, your car, whatever, think about your UI. Think about the experience that you're having with it, and understand how difficult it had to get to that place. How difficult it was to get to that place. Because it's not always just as simple as, oh, I'm going to turn this on or I'm going to do this one thing. There has to be a lot of thought process put into it. There has to be a lot of conceptualizing of your product and how you want to represent it and what you want people to use. Now, the last part about UI that I'll cover is permissions. Permissions are a huge thing with the UI in and of itself, because in order to make a UI function appropriately on a system that has security protocols, and in order to follow proper security protocols when designing a system, you have to have some sort of permission to prevent people from making changes that they're not allowed to do, right? There's a considerable number of security concerns with UI, and we'll eventually get into all of them at some point. But really, the big concern for UI that often gets overlooked is, how do we provide permissions to users? I recently went through a platform migration where we moved from one platform to another. And in the old platform, it was very granular, the permissions I could assign to users. It was extremely easy. I could assign this particular region is available for this user, but only under these circumstances. I could actually craft a permissions package for each technician type inside of this software. When we moved over to this new solution, it's not like that. There are aspects of it. I can control what features they can see inside of each and every piece. But when I remove permissions for one thing, it removes permissions for a whole list of other stuff that isn't identified in that information. So for instance, if I allow somebody to see multiple companies, but I don't allow them to see all companies, then they can't see a particular field for the companies that they do have access to. And it's kind of insane that they lose that access because, well, I have a client who needs to have full control of their organization, and I need them to be allowed to see every field that they could possibly look at. And so those are some of the battles that you have with UI and permissions. How do you design your permission structure? What's important? What permissions do you call out? It's going to be a pain in the ass for you to add a permission to every single aspect of your UI. So how do you control it from a perspective of, I want these people to be able to see this, but not able to see this when they have this particular permission? How do you make those decisions? And that is a very difficult aspect of UI design. And sometimes you can handle a lot of that in the back end, but if you have something displayed that you don't have access to as a user, that can also make things difficult. So it's honestly sometimes better to have that all on the UI side, have that all on the front end, so that way the back end doesn't have to worry about that, and just have additional checks on the permission level on the back end, so that if there's somehow, some way they get past security components, it prevents them from making those changes anyways. So that's there's a lot of shit I'm obviously skipping over, because holy shit, there's a lot to UI and permissions and access. But for the most part, you just have to remember that the UI front end and the UI back end work together to try to craft an experience for you as the users that allows you to use it. And the best ones allow you to use it intuitively, while the worst ones ask you if you're sure 100,000 times. Well, that's all I have for today, guys. And I hope you have a great day.